Hi, my name is Julie Burtinshaw, and I'd like to tell you about my latest book, Hangman, the true story of Canada's first official executioner. Before I continue, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm talking to you from Vancouver on the unceded territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. Hangman is my first nonfiction book. It's the story of John Robert Radcliffe, who immigrated from England to Canada in 1890 to become Canada's first official executioner. Initially, he took the job to better himself and his family and to ensure that death came quickly and mercifully to the condemned. Over time, he came to question not just capital punishment, but the Canadian justice system and his role within it. This is briefly the plot, but Hangman is also about getting what you wish for, only to discover it will be the thing that destroys you. It's about the terrible cost of ambition and a family in turmoil. Radcliffe finds himself fighting not just his demons, but the hypocrisy of the times he lived in. John Radcliffe was a conflicted human, and it was this aspect of his character that drew me to him from the beginning. Is it possible, I asked myself, to be both good and evil? How do we justify our choices? And can we live with these justifications in the end, or will they destroy us, no matter how good our intentions might be? Who was John Radcliffe? A loving family man? A flamboyant storyteller who liked to stretch the truth? Or a drunken, cold-hearted killer? These are the questions I wanted to find the answers to. 2 years after Radcliffe arrived in Canada with his family, he realized his dreams. With a job as head waiter of Sunnyside Club, one of Toronto's most prestigious rowing clubs, and the appointment of official executioner, circumstances were as good as they'd ever be for the Radcliffes. Radcliffe's position as Canada's only official hangman took him all across Canada, and it's estimated he hanged up to 150 people during his lifetime. I'm going to read a description of one of those hangings that took place in Victoria, BC. Albert Strobel was 20 years old when he was convicted of killing a local farmer in the Sumas Prairie in British Columbia. Despite 2 trials, the first ending in a hung jury, Strobel was sentenced to hang in Victoria, BC, though many doubted his guilt. I'd like to read you a description now of the Strobel hanging. Traveling across the country normally took 8 days, but winter snowstorms slowed the trip down, so John left earlier than he would have in warmer months to guarantee his arrival a week before the execution date. Acting in his official capacity as a representative of the Government of Canada in a high-profile case, he would at last be able to perform an execution using the long drop method. This was really important to John because this was the most merciful way of hanging someone, and it involved calculating the victim's body weight to determine how far they should be dropped so as to sever their spinal cord, so that in that way the hanging would not result in strangulation. John was passionate about introducing this to Canada. Determined to modernize the hanging process, he designed a scaffold that would be constructed in pieces at a local joinery and then assembled in the prison yard the day before. Not only would this allow the scaffold to be disassembled for storage or use elsewhere, it would spare the condemned man the sounds of construction. John made sure to pack a good amount of brandy in his suitcase. The train trip was a blur of liquor-induced sleep and semi-conscious awakenings. When he arrived in Victoria, he checked into his lodging, a drafty waterfront hotel a few blocks from the imposing new Parliament buildings. Once settled, he quickly developed a routine, overseeing work on the gallows during the day before joining the dock workers to drink in the hotel bar at night. The bartender, a burly, thick-set man with few teeth, recognized him as a stranger the first night he walked in. "You're not from around here," he said, spittle flying through the gaps in his teeth. "That's right," John answered, taking a step back and wiping his face with his coat sleeve. John thought there must be a bar fight behind every gap in the man's mouth. "I'll have a pint of whatever you're serving." Blowing into his cupped hands to warm them up, he said in a friendly tone, "Is it always this cold?" Early in his travels, John had discovered that talking about the weather usually disarmed even the most suspicious people. "It's the damp. People say it gets into the bones." The man wore shirt sleeves and beads of sweat stood out on his forehead. "Don't feel the cold myself." "I can see that." "Have a seat by the fire. Are you here to watch Strobel swing?" This was a small town, and people would figure out his identity soon enough. You could say that. The bartender put a beer down in front of him. "You're a lawman or a relative or..." He snapped his fingers. "Ah." John nodded. "I'm exactly who you think I am." The big man's eyes lit up. "Mr. Radcliffe, we've been expecting you." Abandoning the bar, he took a seat opposite John. "The hanging is all anyone talks about." "What are they saying?" "The town is split. Some say the boy is innocent. Others think him guilty. I suppose we'll never know the truth. Others just mind the expense. You'll never believe it, but I've heard those 2 trials cost over $10,000. I even read in the paper that Strobel sat for a picture. He wore a fancy tuxedo over his prison clothes. Can you imagine? He's famous, but for all the wrong reasons." On the morning of January 30th, John arrived at the jail early, where he idled near the death cell, chatting with the other office officials, a collection of guards, doctors, and police officers. The men stomped their feet and rubbed their hands to chase out the cold as they waited. "An unpleasant day for the job," one officer noted. "We had to chip the ice off the gallows this morning. I'll be glad when this is over." John thought most execution days were unpleasant, especially with a dull headache from too much brandy the night before. "How is the prisoner faring?" "Well," the warden replied, "he's composed, considering what lies ahead. Last night he said goodbye to his brothers and sisters without tears, but the minute after they left, he had a breakdown, weeping and shaking before recovering himself. The guards aroused him at 6 for his last breakfast. Then Father Nicolai arrived. "Might I ask," he added, "do you judge him innocent or guilty? None of us can agree." "The guilt or innocence of a condemned man is not my concern," John replied easily. "As you, I do what is required in my job." The question of guilt or innocence of a condemned man was one constantly put to Radcliffe, but he refused to be drawn in. Radcliffe suffered 2 major conflicts in his life that eventually led to his destruction. His home life was a struggle. We know this because his wife Sarah eventually left him, fleeing to England with their 2 daughters, never to return. She left behind their son, who eventually became a Methodist and totally rejected his father. This is fact. In this next reading, I've imagined a scene. This is fiction. They are at home. His wife Sarah belittles his occupation as a hangman, and they argue. His son complains he's being bullied at school. They say, "I'm going to be like him when I grow up." Sarah replies, "That's not true. You'll never be like your father. Not if I have anything to say about it." After Robert went upstairs, Sarah and John continued to bicker. "What do you mean," John says, "not if I have anything to say about it?" "Be sensible, John." Sarah's voice was impatient. "Neither of us wants Robert to follow in your footsteps. It's your fault. His shame in my position comes from you. We're all ashamed of what you do, replied Sarah dryly. Ah, but you're happy to spend the money I earn. His second conflict is with the people of Canada, those very same people who elected a government that supports capital punishment. He knows those people find him repulsive for his role in the justice system, but reminds them throughout the book, I represent the law, just like the police officer and the judge. I represent Canadians, people like you. When I first came across John Radcliffe, I didn't know much about him. The more I discovered, the more I knew I had to write his story. I'd written several historical fiction books in my career, so I dove into the first draft with relish. Writers and readers will understand it's not the same draft that I hold up to you now. Most books require 3 to 7 drafts, sometimes more, and this one was no different. So when my publisher accepted the story and said, sometimes truth is stranger than fiction, why not tell John's story as a nonfiction book? This was new to me. I'd never written a historical nonfiction book, and I suspected the process might be very different, and it was, but not in the ways a writer might suspect. Both genres must have a strong plot, engaging characters, a realistic story arc, conflict, and tension. Both involve tremendous amounts of research, but while nonfiction must be factually true, historical fiction allows the writer to create characters and scenarios that didn't exist outside of the writer's imagination. In nonfiction, if the facts are available, they cannot be skewed or invented. Instead of based on a true story, the nonfiction book is a true story. My final reading finds Radcliffe toward the end of his career. He has lost so much, including all rationale for his chosen work. Approaching his mid-50s, he feels like a much older man. Over his lifetime, he spoke openly to reporters about his life as a hangman, and although he was not always truthful, he was always vulnerable. So I thought it would be appropriate to end this reading in John Radcliffe's own words. And so I pacified my conscience in this way for many years, but of late it is killing me. I suffered the agony of mind that was terrible and began to feel as if iron bars tightened around me. The remorse which comes over me is terrible, and my nerves give out until I have not slept until days at a time. I used to say to the condemned persons as I beckoned with my hand, come with me. Now, at night when I lie down, I start up with a roar as victim after victim comes up before me. I can see them on the trap, waiting a second before they face their maker. They haunt me and taunt me until I'm merely crazy with unearthly fear. I am 200 times a murderer, but I won't kill another man. So whatever we may think about capital punishment or how we might judge the man who became an appointed killer for the state way back in 1892, we must recognize that Radcliffe, in all of his flaws, left behind a legacy based on his strong feelings of lessening the torment faced by his victims. He fought to end public executions and succeeded. By the end of his time as an executioner, the condemned no longer had to face thousands of faces celebrating their end. He worked to improve the method of hanging, so death was as quick and as merciful as possible. He treated his victims with dignity and refused to wear a face mask, forcing himself to look them in the eye in their final moments, no matter how painful this might have been. Like in any good fiction, characters must change over time. They must learn from their experiences. They must surprise the reader. Nonfiction characters are no different, but some, like Radcliffe, surprise even their biographer. He balked at hanging women, recognizing their crimes often stemmed from self-defense. And though he failed in the fight against his own demons, drink, depression, and anger against the society who condemned him for doing their will, he never stopped fighting for the condemned. Toward the end of his life, Radcliffe, Canada's former hangman, said, "Murderers should be allowed to live as long as possible and work out their salvation on behalf of the state. It is the only solution, for the stamp of Cain is on my brow and on the brow of the government and the nation." This, I think, is his true legacy. I hope you enjoyed learning about Hangman, the true story of Canada's first official executioner. I'd like to thank the Victoria Public Library for the opportunity to talk to you about this book, which you can find in bookstores and libraries everywhere. Thank you.